So I came across this article. China cracks down on aggravated party cadres in Xinjiang and Tibet. So this is not really recent news, but I've always wanted to do a video regarding the conflict between China and Tibet. But since this thing has kind of died down by now, I didn't think of it much until a recent discussion I've had with a Haitian French person that got me really annoyed and upset. But at the same time, I felt a bit ashamed of myself at getting upset at this, and I even asked him to respect my opinions, both of which went against my principles, which is to be emotionally detached during serious discussions on controversial topics, and that respect can only be earned, not demanded or even asked. But in any case, the reason I was so upset was not because he supports a free Tibet, but his condescending attitude, kind of like, oh no, come on, you can't be serious, while just being completely stupid with his arguments. And I will tell you why, something that I think would be good to keep in mind if you read articles of this kind regarding the conflict between China and Tibet. So I'm going to give you a little history of China for you to think about when dealing with this topic. Okay, so the argument that we've had, which is relevant to any article on the Tibet-Chinese relations, as I mentioned, the argument is whether Tibet is being systematically oppressed by the Chinese government. Now, my argument is that if you mean, are they especially oppressed relative to the rest of China, because as anyone with a brain should know, government always oppress its people. Even modern democratic government is oppressing its people, not to mention a non-democratic dictatorial one. So if you ask, are they especially being oppressed, I would say no. Now at this point, this Haitian guy I'm debating with brings up this point, which I'm sorry to say is a point that the leftists, especially when I'm conversing with a black person, love to bring up. And by the way, no disrespect to any individual black person, just that this is what I've always encountered. And I live down in the South where about 50% of the people are blacks. This point that they brought up is that, oh, but the Tibetans are different from the Chinese. They are from a different country that was conquered by the communist Chinese and then being oppressed by it. So I basically told them, well, no, Tibetans are Chinese. We consider them to be Chinese just as Americans considered Hawaiians to be Americans. And this is where he gave me the, come on, really? Condescending smirk. And he didn't really give me an answer when I asked him, well, what did you understand by Chinese? What did you understand by what the Chinese people are? And apparently no Westerners I've talked to does. So here comes my little history lesson. Now, the term China is actually from the West. We call our country 中国, which literally means the middle country. Came from the old egotistical belief that China was the center of the world. Obviously during the time when people thought the world was flat. No, seriously, when my dad saw Lord of the Rings with me, he insisted that the Middle Earth should be China, so why are all these white people here and no Chinese people? True story. But where did the term China come from? So it come from, show you this map, it come from the land of the Qin. So qi is a consonant that Westerners do not have. It's not really a ch or a ch, but that's, what the Westerners use as the closest. But whatever, who knows how things are pronounced back then, right? Now, the reason why China was called land of the Qin was that the Qin dynasty that started around 221 BC was the first unified imperial China. Before that, the land of the Qin, or the Qin state, was the modern day, so you can see here, The modern-day provinces composed of Gansu and Shanxi, the latter of which was where I was born and where most of my relatives currently reside in. And this is also where the terracotta warriors were discovered, as well as the rest of the tomb of the first emperor, who called himself the first emperor of Qin, literally Qin Shi Huang. So at 221 BC, the land of Qin, as you see here, conquered 6 other major sovereign states. This is the land of the Qi, the land of the Chu, the land of the Yan, the land of Zhao, and the land of Wei, and also the land of Han right here. So collectively, this has formed what is called the land of the Qin because, well, they conquered everybody else. And then that's where China comes from, from Western pronunciation. So as you can see here, China, by the source of its etymology, it was only about less than a third of what China is today, area-wise. And it is through conquest by the original Qin people, the original Chinese, you could argue, that China was formed, the first imperial China was formed. Which means that by this definition, by the Western etymology source, everybody else are technically not Chinese. This will include the province of the city where I grew up in China, as you see here, which is Canton, or we call Guangzhou. And back then, this is called the U.S. states collectively. So this is why we call the Cantonese dialect Yueyu, or literally the U.S. speech. So they were not Chinese during the land of the Qin times. They were a separate ethnic group, the Cantonese people. Now, the Qin dynasty lasted very short, only about 15 years. And after that came the Han dynasty. As you can see, by conquest, it has expanded out into southern China and even into modern-day Xinjiang, which is the neighbor of Tibet. So Xinjiang is right here and Tibet is here. Xinjiang is a province that some would call East Turkestan. So this was the dynasty, the Han dynasty was the dynasty from which modern-day Chinese identify themselves as the Han ethnic. This is where it all came from. And the Han ethnic right now is composed of something like 93% of China. So I'm a Han, for example. However, the indigenous people, or majority of the people from Xinjiang, are not considered to be Hans. They're either the Uyghur, the Kazakh, the Hui, or other. This is where most of the Muslims reside in China. The Uyghur and the Kazakhs are of a different ethnic group historically, or genetically, you can say. One is from a Turkish origin, and the other is from a Turkish-Mongolian origin. Whereas the Hui are historically, ethnically similar to the Hans, but they're not considered to be Hans since they are of a different culture. They adopted the Muslim one. And by the way, the Hui are also the second most populous ethnic minority in China. So basically, I am a Han. Why? Because some ambitious douchebags more than 2,000 years ago conquered my ancestors. That's why. So over the different dynasties in China, they expanded China. And sometimes the territory expanded, sometimes they collapsed, as you can see from this movie map. Through these expansions and conquests, in various times, Tibet, the Tibetan territories, were under Chinese sovereignty. but there were two dynasties in which pretty much all of modern Tibet was under the Chinese sovereignty. The first one is during the Yuan dynasty, as you can see here. And that's during the Mongolian conquest, as you can see here. So this is Tibet right here. So this was when China was under Mongolian sovereignty, but they eventually kept the dynasty name from the Chinese. And this lasted for about a century. The second time, the entirety of Tibet was within the empire of Imperial China, was the Qing dynasty, or Westerners will call it the Manchurian dynasty. This is also the last imperial dynasty of China, and this lasted for about 270 years. Tibet was conquered a bit later, around 1720, I believe. But what this means that Tibet was part of Imperial China for approximately 3 centuries and a half, which is longer than the establishment of the United States of America, especially taking into account the unification of North and South. So next time you hear somebody say that Tibet has never been part of China until the communists conquered them, well, according to this history, yes and no. Because one of the arguments would be that the Mongolians and the Manchurians are not Chinese because they're of a different ethnic group than the Hans. So they're not from the land of the Qing, and they're not Han ethnics. And therefore, China never conquered Tibet until the communists. Well, actually, even this is an oversimplification because, first of all, the Manchurian dynasty was when Western colonialism happened. And the Westerners most certainly called this land Imperial China. So it would be a self-contradiction given the fact that, again, the name China was adopted by the West. But it's even more complicated than this, because the Manchurian dynasty was eventually toppled by Chinese nationalists who established the Republic of China. You might have heard of the name Sun Yat-sen, or who we call Sun Zhongshan. Well, Chinese people have multiple names. That was what was fashionable back then. Sun Yat-sen was the first president of the Republic of China. He was the co-founder of the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, if I'm using the retarded Western pronunciation of this. And this government was supposed to be a democratic one. That eventually didn't happen, however, as Sun Yat-sen was booted out of the government, and then other nationalist officials took over, eventually as dictators. Now, the ironic part of all this was that it was the Chinese nationalists, after they toppled the Manchurian imperial government, who kicked Manchurian power out of Tibet. And it was the Manchurian government that adopted the Dalai Lama to be the sovereign officials under Imperial China. So you could actually say that it was the Chinese who first liberated Tibet. But immediately after this event, the ruling Tibetan government declared independence. So did the Republic of China recognize this? Of course not. Imagine if something similar were to happen in the United States. Imagine if, let's say in the future, Asian powers are doing colonialism bullshit in the United States, and an American Nationalist Party finally got rid of them and kicked the Asians out. And then Hawaii or Texas suddenly immediately declared independence. Do you think the United States will recognize that? I seriously doubt it. So the Republic of China, as you can see here, also determined Chinese borders based on the Manchurian borders, which included Tibet, and they have a map of their own imperial country. And I think this is a heuristic as any to determine your country's borders after so many years of fighting colonialism and civil conflicts. So I kind of find it a huge double standard when Westerners, especially Americans, have no problems with, for example, Israelis drawing a border based on their 2,000-year-old book, but Chinese drawing a border around Tibet based on the Manchurian Empire? No, oppression! Anyways, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, developed his political philosophy known as the Three Principles of the People. One of which is the nationalist idea of a single Chinese people. And in Chinese, we call this group, our group, the Hua people. That's why we call ourselves as part of the Zhonghua. Even in today's China, it's called 中华人民共和国. Zhonghua literally means the Middle Hua people. Chinese people outside of China are called Huayi, or the Hua ethnic group. This is the term used by Chinese ethnics for Chinese Americans, for example. So you see, the Hua national ethnics is formulated to be composed of 5 major ethnic groups, including the Han, the Mongols, the Tibetans, the Manchurians, and finally the Muslims, including the non-Han ethnic Muslim groups such as the Uyghur and the Kazakh, as I have mentioned before. So once again, the Tibetans were considered to be Chinese from the beginning of the Republic of China, which once again was established supposedly as a democratic government. Food for thought. Now, moving forward, during the Republic of China, the Japanese invaded China, conquered most part of it, during World War II. After the Japanese were kicked out, joined by the nationalists and the communists, the nationalists and communists fought each other for power. This would be during the Chiang Kai-shek era, or we call it Jiang Jieshi. Yeah, the names are so different, that's why I even failed Chinese history during world history school in the US. Not to all Chinese learners complain about learning Western names translated to Chinese. So, Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and the US, of course, propagated positive lies on this dude, and obviously supported Taiwanese independence. So, communism, bad. Every other form of government, good. So, under the communists, Republic of China became then the People's Republic of China. And then almost immediately afterwards, the communist government started fucking shit up in their country. Because communism is an ideology based on violent revolutions. So they started many quote-unquote reforms. Majority of the big ones turned out to be a complete disaster. This, of course, included ensuring that China is a quote-unquote progressive secular state, which ended up meaning destroying anything that's even remotely quote-unquote backward, non-progressive, anti-secular, or somehow reminded them of Western colonialism. So Tibet, being a theocratic culture, would obviously be hit really bad. But so did the rest of the country that had these indications, judged by the communists, of course. My mother's side of the family, for example, was one that was, there's some really bad stories about that. So the communists went into Tibet specifically for reforming to their values, as they did everywhere else. Some of these things could be argued to be positive, such as getting rid of feudal serfdom, which they did, but most of it was pretty bad. And I would say that any kind of forced reforms not passed by the voice and will of the people tends to turn out bad, not to mention a dictatorial regime. But still to this day, the Chinese government justified going into Tibet and fucking shit up by this one arguably good thing, which is freeing the serfs. Now, whether you agree with this or not, one cannot ignore the once again double standard that Americans especially used to justify the Civil War, that it was needed to end slavery. But essentially, the North defeated the South, conquered it, you could say, and the justification was ending slavery. Now, if you look at even their statements, it's eerie how similar the competitive arguments are. The Chinese say that they ended slavery in Tibet, and and Tibet said that they brought more suffering, and Tibet was undergoing reforms anyways. They also claim that they have more territorial rights to other regions. Okay. Now imagine if an American Southern historian said the same thing, that the Confederate government was going through positive reforms in the South, so the forced liberation of black slaves does not just justify the amount of Civil War casualty. Do you think they would be taken seriously in the mainstream? Of course not. But they paint Tibet as this peace-loving utopia being screwed up by the Chinese, who supposedly had no claim to their land. And I can guarantee you that if Tibet at that time gained independence, its government would not be significantly better than the communist government. We are talking about two forms of dictatorial government. One is a secular dictatorial government, and the other one is a theocratic dictatorial government. I might be more sympathetic to the Dalai Lama and the exiled Tibetan government if their determination was, when Tibet gains independence, we will introduce a democratic government, and if the people should vote that the Dalai Lamas and their theocratic officials will no longer govern Tibet, then we will step down. But they didn't, because just like all of human history, it's a power struggle. That's it. So here's my opinion on the matter. The only justification for a place and a group of people within a nation to separate from that nation is through democratic voting, because the history of mankind is complicated. No place automatically, in principle, deserves independence from its government. Now, at this point, I know that some of my viewers would say, well, China is not doing democracy, are they? Well, no, but they're not doing that anywhere in their territory. So if you support Tibetan independence, what is there to stop independence of other ethnic autonomous regions, such as Inner Mongolia or other provinces? And by the way, communist China actually end up with less territories than the Republic of China or the Manchurian imperialist China. And if you support any region in gaining independence, then you must apply that to anywhere. So if, let's say, Hawaii demands a democratic vote to separate from the US, they should be allowed to be given one. And if they win the vote, they should be allowed to separate. Or if Texas or anywhere in the South demands a vote, which a few years ago they did, to separate from the states, they should be allowed one and separate if the majority says that they want separation. So in principle, I don't give a shit, but it's what people want, and they need to take the consequences of their actions. But the double standards and the argument of ethnicity are what I consider to be immensely stupid and annoying. And by the way, please name me a single major nation on Earth, let's say a country with 50 million people or more, that is composed of one historical ethnicity. And also name me one major nation on Earth that did not have a history of conquest and violence. Lastly, I would like to mention that personally, I would right now prefer not any part of China to separate as of now. And this is not because I'm somehow a patriot. Really, I could care less about patriotism and nationalism. I deem those ideologies usually doing more harm than good. The reason is only that any country that have part of it separate would mean a period of reconstruction, which usually means civil conflict, which would dismantle a central government, which would stop trade and essentially blockade economic development and growth. And so I do perceive China is becoming an economic competitor to the United States. The United States have a government which would do anything to keep their power monopoly all over the world. So they would love it if China is reduced to the size of the Qin dynasty, or even less. Um, but the end result, monopoly, is bad for everybody because monopoly is bad. Power monopoly is even worse. So I guess that would be the only reason why I currently prefer a unified China as it is now. But of course, an argument can be made that this does not justify individual rights being infringed upon or oppressed. If you make that argument, then I really have nothing to say against that. However, I am skeptical of what would actually happen if a democratic voting were to happen in Tibet. It's not 100% certain to me that they would vote to separate. So this is addressing another condescending smirk from the Haitian guy I talked to. He kind of said something like, "Come on, how can you even suggest that Tibetans would not want to break away from China?" Well, just in 2014, there was a democratic vote for Scotland from becoming independent from the UK, and everybody I talked to predicted that they would vote yes. Oh my God, Scots have been so oppressed by the Brits for so long. Why wouldn't they? Now imagine their surprised face that an overwhelming majority said no. However, just to be safe, the Chinese government have tried to populate Tibet with Han ethnics in case there's such a future democratic voting were to occur. Once again, just how similar is this action when compared to the state of Israel, which accepts Jewish immigrants from all over the world to ensure a Jewish majority in Israel? But what the Chinese doing is just bad because they're commies. So the conclusion from all of this is, when you look at the broad picture, mankind is the same anywhere. They go through similar history, similar social behavior, and similar political struggles. Understanding this is what will prevent future mistakes from happening. Putting a blame game on one side and not looking at the other side will repeat such bad history. And if we don't educate people the big picture and to show these kind of comparative histories to them, bad things will happen because we will then never learn from our mistakes. So stop playing the blame game, stop talking about reparation, and start learning history from the big picture. Then we might finally achieve progressivism with the right tools.